This is the story of Olga Rempel, my grandmother, her origins, her birth, and her early life in Russia.
My grandparents from my mother's side came from a place up north between Moscow and the Caucasian. And the place was named Riebensdorf. That was in Ostrogozhsk, and Voronezh was the government. That's how they call it. And it was for a couple of generations. They came in the same time when Katerina II had told she will bring over some German farmers to show the Russian farmers how to farm. And so she brought maybe over 400 families over, and they settled right in the middle on a big place of land and started to farm there. And then my grandfather, they were getting quite wealthy because they were very diligent and worked hard. Their first houses were made from straw and dirt. And then after years, my grandfather built a syrup factory where he made syrup from
Sugar beets,
sugar canes and sugar beets. And then I guess he wanted to go over to start producing wheat. Everybody started to produce in those years wheat, because the Russian people didn't know much about wheat. They ate mostly rye and barley. And so he traveled to look for land. And about 15 miles away from Millerovo, in the Don Gebiet, where the Don runs through, that's the river, he found a piece of land which belonged to a Russian nobleman. It was in a big estate, 15 miles away from Millerovo. I said it's already. And here was about 2,000 desetin of land. And he had a family of 7. And then his brother-in-law, my grandmother's brother, he came with his family too. And so those 2 brothers-in-law, they started this village named Abrahamsfeld. It belonged to this man by the name of Abram. And they made it like an L shape. And had for each child what got married would get 40 acres of land and a house, and then they got some more land afterwards. When the family would grow, they would get more land. And so our family did get some too. And my mother was married, and she had to move away because she married to a different place. I don't know exactly where it was. And she was 18, and when she was 24, her husband died. He was grafted, and he died of typhus fever. And she had 3 little boys. So she came to live with my grandparents in this Abrahamsfeld because they had that big house, and there were lots of rooms. It was the house of this estate man, Abram. And so I remember, I wasn't born then, but later on, there were 2 rooms on one end, and this is the rooms my mother had in. And her oldest sister, my mother's oldest sister, Catherine, was married to a Martin Hepting. And they lived in Abrahamsfeld already too, because my grandfather gave them 40 acres too. And then this Martin Hepting's youngest brother, Henry, was in a war. He was drafted too. And he was married too. And while he was drafted, his wife gave birth to a baby girl and died when she had the baby. So he came home and he was a young widower. And then he came to visit his brother, Martin, and his wife was my mother's sister. And this is where mother and father met. And but my mother had 3 little boys, but I guess he loved her just the same. And a year later, they were married and lived for the first year with my grandfather, Lechner. Lechner was his name. In those 2 rooms at the end where Mom lived before. And after almost a year later, they had a little girl. That was me then. And my father, it was in October, and my father had to help to dress. And that was miles and miles away where they had the dressing. It took them 6 weeks to get all the wheat dressed. How you say it? I don't know. So he was gone. I was born on Thursday, and they would come home just for weekends. And then on Saturday night, when he came home, my mother tells me, he took me in his arms, and he couldn't get his eyes off me because I looked so much like him. I was dark, and he was dark hair and dark eyes. My mother was blonde. And then the whole night, when I just made a peep and cried, then he would take me and carry me around. He was so happy to have a little girl now. And then on Monday he had to go back again to work. But this is where I was born. And then a year, I don't know how long after that, Grandpa gave us 40 acres of land, and my father built a house, or whoever, I don't remember that. And then and it was not too far away from our grandpa and grandma. It was in that L shape. They lived on one side and we lived on the other side. And we had just across, we could see their house and we could run over. We had there a nice pad where we could run to grandma and to Grandpa Lechner. And so we lived there. And we were quite happy. We had a farm too, with horses and cows and chickens and what have you. And I remember there was one cow. They would take them out on the streets in the morning after the milking, and then there would come a boy who would take them, or a man who would take them all to pasture. In the evening it would come back, and there was one cow which was very easy to milk, and that was my cow. I was maybe 4 or 5, and they allowed me to milk it, and I was so thrilled. I just so we had a very happy. I had after then was another sister born, Elizabeth, and then after when I was 3 years old, we had a little brother, Henry. But after his birth, my mother had some infection in her sciatic nerve, and she couldn't walk. So for almost a half a year, we would take her out, and in the summertime, she loved so much the garden, and we had a big, big garden, which used to belong to this big house, but somehow we had it now. But the rest of the families, they could come and get their share of fruit. And this garden was so big. There were so many trees. One corner was just cherries, and another corner was just just plums, and then all kinds of pears, and all kinds of apples, and anything you could think. And there was a big ravine, not a ravine, like a ditch, surrounded this garden, and then from the inside they planted a bush which produced like little plums, the damson plums, and they had thorns. So it was a nice hedge. No cows or nothing could come in. And in the middle there was a gate. And in the summertime, we always had a Russian couple living down there. They made a little hut in the middle of the garden from straw, and this is where they lived. And all around they had straw, and then he always picked the nice, if there fell off some fruit, we children could eat it. But then my mother wanted to go to the garden too, and it was a little ways off from our place. So I remember when I was about 3.5 years old, we had a girl who looked after us children, and we had a maid who cooked the meals and had other help. And this girl, we had somebody, maybe my father, I don't know. We had a little wagon, and we put mother on that wagon, and then this girl would go with her. It was going down the hill, so we had to be very careful, hold on. I remember we as little ones were holding on so the wagon wouldn't get out of hands, and would run down with mother together. And that girl that looked after us, the Russian girl, she was leading it. And then would take mother down in the garden, and then she was so happy to eat fruit, and then we played there. Had a wonderful time. And then when I was about 7 years old, all of a sudden we had noticed, and they said a war was on. It was 1914. And then they said our father had to be drafted, and he had to go to war too. And I remember how I was very close with my father, and I had my doll in one arm, and the other one running after my daddy. Wherever he went, in a barn or wherever he went, I went after him and cried. I said, "Daddy, you can't go away." And I was so heartbroken that he had to go away. But in August he had to go. So we had to say goodbye to him. And then there was so much wheat left, we had still to thresh. And then the men were all taken too. But we had some help, 2 or 3 men. They all were gone to war. So we had to get more girls, and Russian girls, to help. And then I remember how mother would go every morning with a big couple of loads of wheat on big wagons and take them to Millerovo, 15 miles away. She would go in front, and then all these other maids, they would, I don't know how many loads, I don't remember that. They would take the wheat to Millerovo. And the Millerovo was a big flour mill, DeFehr Dyck, and this is where they took it. And then the young girl that looked after us, she would stay with us at home. And the teacher was taken too, so we didn't have any school in our Abrahamsfeld, and nothing. So this went on. 14, Daddy was gone. 15 and 16. Then I was almost 9 years old. So my father came home just for a short while of furlough in August 1916. And then he said, "We have no school here, and Olga will be 9 years old in October, she has to go to some school. And he was stationed now. He never had to go to war. But he had a nice handwriting. And this is why he was stationed now in DeFehr. That's maybe 1,000 miles down south from where we lived. And there he was the secretary for a general. And he had to write letters to the Tsar because of his good handwriting. In those days they didn't have any typewriters, so that's what he had. And he lived in a big, maybe 5-story house, and they had a kitchen there where all the generals and all these people were fed, and he had a room for himself. So he said to my mother, I'm going to take Olga along, and there's a very nice German school, Lutheran school, 8 grades has, and he spoke already to the principal, and they will take her in. So in a way I was glad to go to school. I loved to learn, but in a way I didn't like to go away from Mom. But I liked my dad too, and I was happy to go with him too. So he took me along. And I remember coming there maybe in September, and it was very warm. In that DeFehr, there were never snow. It was so much salt. It was nice and warm. And the place where Dad was stationed was a little bit out of DeFehr, of the city. So I had to go at least an hour on a streetcar to the school. And there was a river going through the city. So I had to go over a big bridge every morning and come back home again, where we lived. And Dad bought for me a little suitcase, something like that, which you had to put on your back. And there I had my books, everything in, and I was so happy. And when I came in that school, everybody spoke nicely German. And I came in grade 1. I was almost the tallest, or the biggest girl, because I was 9, almost 9. But I enjoyed it. And then when I would come home, right, this big 5-story house was located right close to the river. And there was a big, big stump. And they had there a black bear tied on. It was a tame bear. And the cook of the kitchen always told me, here, you can bring this to the bear. And I loved it, but I was scared of the bear. So I would just put it down quickly when he wasn't looking, and then run back and watch him eat. And after a while, he didn't mind. And I could see he wasn't dangerous. And so I enjoyed it very much, and enjoyed school. Then at Christmas time, my father said I was supposed to go earlier to bed, and he had some business to do yet. So he was gone, and I fell asleep, was happy. All of a sudden, middle of the night, I hear somebody talking in our room. I opened my eyes, and who was there? My mother and my little brother, who was 1 year old, Johnny. They came to visit us for Christmas. So I was overwhelmed. I couldn't sleep almost then afterwards, and so I was so happy to see my mother. And they stayed for 2 weeks. And then after, and we had visited, my dad had some friends there, and we had a family. Their name was DeFehr, and he was a cousin to my dad. And he was quite a rich man. He was a pharmacist, and he had 3 apotheken, drugstores in the city. And so we went to visit them too. They invited us. And they had 2 little boys, about maybe 3 and 5. And they had a beautiful home. His wife used to be a Lutheran pastor's daughter. And they had maids and everything so perfect. And the children had so many toys. So I loved it there. And we played, and they used to invite us later on, Dad and myself too. And then came the time when Mother had to go back. And I didn't like it. I wanted to go back home. And then we went on a train, brought her on a train, and I wouldn't let go of her. I grabbed her and told on. I said, I want to go home. And my dad talked to me and tried to persuade me I have to go to school. And but then the train started to go. And we still were on a train. So, but the train stopped a little ways out of the city. I don't know, did it stop for us or did it have to stop? I don't know. And so Dad took me in his arms and just carried me out. And I cried. And so Mom was gone, and my little brother was gone. And so Dad bought me some ice cream and tried to chocolate bars and whatever I wanted. And then after Christmas, all of a sudden, Dad had an order to be stationed in Tuapse. That was a little port town of the Black Sea, and was much closer to our home. Much closer. And so here I was. And then I wanted to go along, and Dad said, no, there is no school like this. You have to stay here. And I loved studying. And then he found a place with the janitor of the school. They lived on the same yard where the school was. A German people, very fine people. They had 2 children who were about my age, and they went to that school too. And right beside them was a beautiful house where the pastor, the Lutheran pastor of this church, and right at the corner was the church, a big, beautiful Lutheran church in the middle of DeFehr, the big street. And behind was the school, very big yard. And this pastor lived next to the janitor's house, a nice house, and they had 8 children, the pastor. And some my age, some younger and some older. And they had a big room that was their playroom. And the girls had toys, little tables with all kinds of dishes, and dolls, and everything you could. I had never seen such nice dolls. The boys had their own corner where they played, but I was just in my glory here. And so every free time, I always invited me over, come, or when they ate, and I was there, and they invited me to stay with them, and I was like at home there. And this pastor, he loved roses, and he had, I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's close to 30 or 40 kinds of roses in his garden. And we couldn't play too much in there because he sprayed them, and I guess, I don't know what he did, but anyway, but we could look at them. And so I stayed there, and I didn't mind. Dad and Mom, they wrote me letters, and my grandpa and grandma wrote me letters, and I could write already now. So I wrote them back a letter to my grandpa and grandma Lechner, and they were so happy that I could write already, and I could write to them. And but when I came to school after Christmas, the teacher said, Olga, you have to go in a different class. So I was a little surprised. I thought I had done something. And she said, you're She didn't say too smart, but you will be going now to grade 2. And I was already 9 years old, so it wasn't such a big thing. And then I went to grade 2, and so I had to make new friends again. But it was fine, and I liked to play in the yard. They had so many, all kind of things to do, schaukeln, sing, swings, and all kind of stuff. And then it was almost over. The school was almost over in spring. And my father wrote me a letter. He will be coming then and then to pick me up and take me home. School was just till April there that time. And so I was so happy Daddy was coming too, and I can go home. I started to pack my stuff already, and I thought I was so happy. And then a couple of days later, I got a telegram, and it said, "I'm sorry I can't come now because Grandpa and Grandma died, the Lechners. And I have to go home first for the funeral." So I remember how I went with this telegram. I went around and cried, because I loved my grandparents so much too. Then I thought I never will see them. And then after maybe a week or two, my father came to pick me up. And then he told me the whole story, how the murderers came into their house and how they killed them both. And I was so shocked. And when I came home, I went over to see the whole thing, and I still could see now Grandpa and Grandma had a policeman in boarding room and at their place. And then they had an 18-year-old girl who was helping Grandma with their house work. And Grandpa had borrowed a rich man in Millerovo who had a brick factory. He had borrowed him 12,000 rubles. And this man wrote an open card to my grandfather that my grandfather was supposed to come to Millerovo and get his money. And that's when the revolution started. It was in 1917 when the revolution started already in spring. So the jails were opened and all the people were freed. And this was a Russian post office. And somebody must have read the card. And so they thought, now there's money. And we want that money. So Grandpa went to Millerovo. I guess they watched him go there, but they didn't watch enough and didn't see that he took the money to the bank. He didn't even take it home. But they thought he had it at home. And then they went, and there were 7 men who were involved, 7 bandits. And one of them was a man who worked for Grandpa as a help, and he knew everything where it was. I guess he was hired and offered money. And so when they came there, and they had from the outside shutters, and they were open, and my mother was there because all these Grandpa had to look after 7 farms because all the men were drafted. Just like my father was gone and my mother's brothers were gone and all of them were gone. So Grandpa made a round every morning and see what had, because they had farm help, girls or women. And so he had to tell them what to do. And he was at our place the day before, and they arranged to to plant potatoes. So Grandpa told him he will be coming tomorrow morning and then help them where to start and everything, these ladies, to plant potatoes. But my grandma was over there in the evening, and they talked about, I guess, more. And then Grandpa had a big Bible, and they had evening devotions together. And these men were already looking in from the outside. And they said, okay, let the old man and his wife pray first. So they let them do that. And then my mother went home, couldn't see anything. And then at night, this policeman, he used to make the rounds in Abrahamsfeld to see if everything was okay. He was hired from the whole Abrahamsfeld people. And when he came home, they met him at the door. And he got in yet. He opened the door, got in, and they were after him. And he went into his room. And I guess he had some guns on himself too. But they had cut him up so much. He had in his room a big marble stove, which was white, all marble up to the ceiling. And that white stove was just full of blood and full of hair and a piece of his nose and everything. It was just terrible. And then and when they were fighting with this, my grandpa heard it, and their bedroom was in the front more. He grabbed Grandma, and they were barefoot, and went to the front door and wanted to run to the church. We had a bell there. If there was a fire or anything, they used to ring the bell, and then the people would come. And so he wanted to get to the bell. And it has been raining that, so this is why we knew that they were outside. They both had dirty feet, wet feet. And this girl, that 18-year-old girl, they took weight. It was like a weighing machine. We had such heavy weights, and they just gave her a blow on one side of her head, so that the other side opened, and she was dead too. So they brought Grandpa and Grandma back in the house because they had outside people watching too. And then they put a towel around Grandpa's neck and hang him on a pole. He had beds with poles. And Grandma had a little kerchief, and they tied that around her neck and hung him on another pole. And this is how all four of them were killed. And my mother was waiting in the morning, and they made all the shutters, closed the shutters from the outside, so nobody could see what they are doing inside. And Grandpa had a picture in the corner hanging the head of Jesus with a thorn crown. And that picture was turned up inside out, from the outside, so they couldn't see him. I guess maybe it bothered them to see it. And but when they were talking to Grandpa, they all had masks. Grandpa recognized the voice of this man who was working for him, and he called him by name, and he said, "What have I done that you do this to me now?" And they looked everything for money, and he says, "I don't have the money here." They had some rugs on the floor and hanging some on the walls too. They tore everything down, and everything was just terrible. And they couldn't find any money. So then they left the whole thing. And then the next morning, my mother was waiting for Grandpa to come, because he said he would come right first in the morning to start planting. So she sent our Russian girl over, who looked after us, a young girl. And she went there, and she saw that all the shutters were closed, and the front door was closed. And then she came back home and she said, "I think they are not home." because everything is closed, or maybe they are sleeping. And my mother's oldest brother, he was like a doctor in the war, where the fighting was. He was a big, strong man, and he could take a wounded man and just carry him in, and so we hear that he came home that night just for a little furlough. And so my mother thought maybe they went to see him, and he lived at the other end of the street. But it can't be, because Grandpa promised to come here. So after a little while, my mother said, I'll go by myself. I'll go and see what's going on. And she went up to the front door, and they had a long veranda along the whole house, a long veranda, but it was glassed in like we have here. And the window from their bedroom was facing this veranda. And Mother went up to that window, to their bedroom, and looked in, and right close to the window, Grandpa hung. And she saw him hanging. She was so panicked. She ran out and just screamed on the top of her voice and tore hair from her. And she was just hysteric. And then the neighbors, they could hear it all. They all came running. And then they would go in and see it and come out. And it was terrible. And everybody was scared to go in. So my uncle, when he came, and then we gave word to him. When he came, he was a doctor. He opened this here, and he went, the last breath came out, but he was gone. It was too late. He couldn't do anything. And so Grandma too, and the girl, and this policeman, he was just cut up. It was a terrible mess. And so my father went home for this funeral, and it was a horrible place. And they had the police there right next morning then, with a dog. And this dog went around, sniffling, and then all of a sudden he made straight to the backyard, and behind the backyard there was an open field yet, and then there was a river which went over to that Russian village where the post office was and all that. And the dog went straight over. They had a little bridge going over it, and then he went along, and then we came to a little house and knocked at the door, and here came this man out. And the dog just jumped on him. So they had him right away. And then he was crying almost. He said, we didn't want to kill him. We didn't want to kill the old people. But because he recognized my voice and called me by my name, the others were scared. If they keep him, it will come out. And but when they had him, he was a little treuherzig, not exactly simple, but he wasn't a bad man. And he loved Grandpa. He didn't want to do him harm. But I guess they offered him so much money, and that was something that he couldn't resist. And so it didn't take very long, and they caught all 7 men. And they were they were killed too. It was capital punishment. But my mother was so upset. She couldn't do anything and just was crying and crying. And she said, I can't see even the house. You see, our street was this way, and this L shape. And Grandma's house was over here, and ours was over here. And so this is how we could see the house. Every morning we could see the house and everything. And she couldn't see it. And then she said, I want to go away from here. I can't stand here. So Grandpa had to arrange. First he came to get me then, from far away, with the fleece. And then when we came home, we packed already, and they made arrangements our house with Grandpa had another brother who rented our house because he had a smaller house, and he had moved not too long ago there, Hepting too. And then we moved to that place where Grandpa was working, to Upstate, to the Black Sea. That's how it happened that we had to move out of our house. Grandma couldn't see it, and she was so full of hatred against these people. She loved her parents so much. Now, who doesn't? Yeah. And she said, oh, if I could, she was full of hatred and full of revenge and everything. And but they were good Lutherans. My grandpa and grandma Lechner, they always had the pastor used to come a couple of times a year to do the confirmation. At 15 they were confirmed, and he always would stay at grandma's and grandma's place for a week or so, and then I remember how these young people that were confirmed, how they walked in pairs from grandma's place to the church. And they made a real alley-like. On both sides they put green branches, and then they walked in white dresses. Yeah, and then we moved to Tuapse, and then I took all summer, I took some lessons, and I finished in the summer the grade 3. And there was a gymnasium, we call it. It's almost like high school, just for girls. And this is where my father enrolled me, and that was grade 4. So in that 1 year, I had grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3, and I came in grade 4. So I was 10 years old then, not quite. And we had a wonderful time there in Tuapse. I enjoyed going to this girls' school. We had French, we had to take French, and the French teacher would just talk French to us. And this beautiful city. Should I talk some more? It was located. Okay, it was located. All three sides of the city were mountains. You could reach it just through so many tunnels. I don't remember. Through tunnels and tunnels and tunnels you had to go to reach that city. And from one side was the Black Sea. Beautiful. And all these mountains, it was more the tropical, the warmer place. They had so many wild apples and wild pears and all kind of wild fruit, which grew in the forest, in the mountains. And we made excursions, we called it, with our French teacher. And she would ask us then, what's this? Qu'est-ce que c'est? And then we had to tell her in French. And so we enjoyed it very much. And my father had the rank of an officer already. That meant he was an officer, but he didn't have to go to war. He was still in the office, still writing. And they gave us a beautiful villa. There was a little, he called it the Church Hill. It had wide marble steps going down to the sea, and then you would go up, and on this side was the city. But this Church Hill, there was right in the middle of the hill was a big church, not so very big, but a church. And then there were like villas. And this villa where we lived was a big house, and because it's a warm climate, they didn't have central heating. There was almost in every room was a fireplace. And then we went one story, and the second story, and then there was a little on top, like how do you call it?
Attic? Roof deck?
Yeah, no, a little like the churches have, where the bell.
steeple or?
Yes, something like a steeple. But you could go inside there too.
Oh, an observation tower.
Yes. And from there we could see the Black Sea far, far down, and we could see the ships coming in. And all around was a big park-like garden. And I never had seen before lorbeer, those laurel. You know what they gave the ones what had victory when they ran?
Laurel bushes.
Yes. And they had, on both sides, there was a nice stake. I wish I could talk English. A nice sidewalk. And on both sides, these laurel bushes. And all kinds of beautiful roses and flowers. And it was a park. And on the other side was going down was a bush. Like there were so many nice flowers in the spring. And this is where we lived. And because father was an officer, he had every morning would come a nice pair of horses and a nice carriage and took us 3 children to school downtown. You know, you had to go down there. There was a way where you could ride down. My sister Elizabeth and my brother Henry. But they went to the grade schools. And I went to this gymnasium, girls' gymnasium. And at afternoon, when the school was out, our carriage was standing there and took us home again. So it was, and we had all the privileges to study free. And Dad had even a man who was a prisoner of war from Germany, you know, from the German war. He was an Uncle Franz, we called him. He had to look after Dad, like, you know, was his, I don't know how you call them. He had to see that Dad had everything, and he helped my mother in everything, doing washing and cooking and everything. Uncle Franz, and we loved him so much. He was like our uncle. He looked after us. And my little brother Johnny, he was 2 years old. He loved to run away from home. You know, we had a big fence with iron, the top with iron and the green painted. Such a fence was around this villa. And he would get out, and Grandpa had his office right where the hill was going down. So it was like against the hill. This was his office. It was not too far away. And he found out where he was. Then he would run down and knock at his door. And then Grandpa would say, "Come in." Nobody came. And then again he knocked. And then Grandpa would open the door. Nobody there. He was behind the door. He was so small, 3 years old. And then when he found out it was Johnny, so he gave him a letter and wrote to Grandma, "Please look after the boy." And they said to him, "Take this letter home to Grandma, to Mommy." And he was so proud to bring a letter to Mommy. So he came and